Hello everybody, welcome back to yet another video of FikarNot.com, now FikarNot from studies. So today we're going to be studying about a brand new chapter on pollination and fertilization. This chapter is somewhat, not even somewhat, like actually completely related to the previous chapter, that is the chapter flower. Well, in our previous lesson, we have learned about the chapter flower, and we have learned about how, there are different types of flowers, the 4 worlds of flowers, the types of flowers, the gamosepalous, polysepalous, fused, free sepals, fused sepals, the stalk of the flower, then the types of plants, bisexual, and then unisexual flowers, all of that, right? So now we're going to go a step further, and we're going to see, well, in these already existing plants, how do fruits come up? Almost like the babies of the plants, right? So without further ado, let's get into the video. So some syllabus that we are going to cover today is self and cross-pollination, that's fertilization, etc. All right? Okay, starting off with pollination. So what is pollination? You have read that stamens of a flower are the male organs. We all know, right? The stamens of a flower are the male organs of the flower, right? Now, the anthers of the stamens produce powdery material called pollen, which consists of particles called pollen grains. So, we all know that the anthers of stamens, they all produce powdery material, right? And this powdery material is called pollen. And they consist of particles called pollen grains. So you have your anther. Inside your anther, you have your pollen sacs. Inside that you have pollen. And inside pollen, you have your pollen grains. Right? We've all learned about this, right? Now, each pollen grains contains a nuclei that participates in reproduction. Because we all know nuclei or the nucleus is like the living part of the cell, right? It's almost like the brain of our body that takes all the decisions of the cell and etc., right? So each pollen grain has a nuclei that participate in reproduction. For initiating this process of process of formation of fruits and seeds, the first step is that the pollen grains must reach the stigma. So basically, all that we have learned in our previous grade is given over here in a paragraph. We all know that inside the anther, we have the pollen grains, the pollen sacs, the pollens, all of that. And once the anther matures and bursts open, these pollen grains need to transport to the stigma of the flower, right? And the stigma needs to catch these pollen grains so that the pollination, the fertilization can go ahead from here, right? Now, it may happen in 3 principal ways. So all of this so-called process called pollination can happen in 3 simple ways. First one, the pollen of the same flower may fall onto its stigma by itself. That's autogamy. Auto meaning self, gamy meaning marriage. So self-marriage, right? Now, when the pollen grains are falling onto the stigma, let's just call that process like a marriage. So pollen grains get married to the pistil, and from there, they have the baby of the plant, that is the fruit, right? So when the pollen of the same flower may fall onto its stigma by itself, it is called as autogamy. Now, the pollen from another flower of the same plant may fall on the stigma, that is gytonogamy. And the pollen of a flower of another plant of some species may fall onto the stigma, allogamy. So let's take these 3. We know that gamy meaning marriage, right? Gamy meaning marriage. So let's take the 3 examples. Autogamy. The same flower may fall onto the same stigma itself. Let's say the pollen and the stigma, they both are of the same religion and the caste. They're marrying to each other, just like arranged marriage. Now, the pollen of another flower of the same plant, meaning if this is a carrot plant, and the pollen from the carrot plant is going to another plant, but of the same kind, of the same plant. That is the carrot plant itself. or two flowers that is born on the same plant, that is called as Dichogomi. So let's say this is a person of the pollen, and the pollen is marrying a person of their same caste, the same religion, but from a different state. And then the pollen of a flower of another plant of same species, of the same species. Again, it's the same caste, it's the same plant, but completely different country. Right? So this is called as allogamy. So autogamy, Dichogomi, and allogamy, sorry. And this transfer can occur through wind, insects, or any other agents used for this transfer. Now the term used for this is cross-pollination. So pollination is the process of the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower. Okay. So example number 1, of course, within the same plant or within the same flower. Example number 2, within the same plant but different flower, as in both the plants are born on the same, both the flowers are born on the same plant. And the third example is, again, your caste is same, the religion is same, but again it's just different species, but just completely two different spots, right? So pollination must occur between plants of the same species, of course, because if I mix like carrot, and the pollen grains of carrot come to tomato, that's not possible, right? Because it has to be of the same species. Imagine tomato and carrot together. Not a pleasant surprise. So many different kinds of flowering plants may be growing in the same vicinity. For example, an orchid may have trees of mango, right? Now, many different kinds of flowering plants, they may be growing, maybe, not always, growing with the same vicinity. So look at this. Over here, as you can see, this is autogamy and Dichogomi, right? Look at this. Same plant, but different flower. So that's Dichogomi. Now, autogamy is within this flower itself, we are having the pollination. And cross-pollination is just two different plants. So this is plant A, this is plant B. From plant A, the pollen grains are coming to plant B, and then the pollination is happening like that. So that is your self-pollination and cross-pollination, right? Now, for example, an orchid may have trees of mango, guava, lychee, etc. And even some wild trees like neem, jamun, shisham may be growing in the neighborhood. Similarly, various crops may be growing in neighboring agriculture fields like wheat, mustard, pulses, vegetables, and so on. The wind may blow away the pollen grains from all such plants together, and thus the flowers of a particular plant may receive all kinds of pollens of its own kind as well as of others. Similarly, insects like bees and butterflies generally do not discriminate between the plants and collect nectar from all different kinds of flowers. So basically, all these insects and all these agents, the wind and all of that, right? They are helping the flower without knowing them. So they have come for their own purpose, like to eat their food, right? To suck on the nectar. But they don't know that they're actually taking the pollen grains with them as well, and they won't exactly see. If I'm sitting on a lily, I will go on another lily. I will sit on a different lily. They won't see that, right? They don't discriminate. They can sit on any flower they want, right? So the pollen grains, it can happen that from the wind, the pollen grains from the wheat plant can go into a lily plant. It can happen, all of this. But once the stigma receives the pollen grains of its own kind, that is when the pollination will actually happen. Okay? Now, again, similarly, insects like bees and butterflies generally do not discriminate between plants and collect nectar from all the kinds of flowers in the process, and the insects are carrying different types of pollen on their bodies. Therefore, the stigma of a flower of any one particular plant receives pollen of its own species as well as of others. It can happen. But nature has so designed that only the pollen of the same species of the plant will survive and grow further to continue the process for reproduction, and rest of the types of pollen will fail to germinate and perish. Okay? Now, to just tell this in a very short way, or a very interesting way, you can say. Let's say I have a complete grassland. Let me draw better grass, okay? let's say I have a complete just like this, okay, and on one side I have wheat growing, and on the other side I have tomato growing. Now both of these are mature plants. So the wind takes the wheat plants, the wind basically it carries the pollen grains of the wheat plant, and then they go and fall on the tomato plant. Now tell me, will the tomato plant pollinate? Will it create wheat tomato? No, right? Because nature has designed all these plants in such a way that the pollen tube that will arrive from the stigma through the style into the ovary and the ovule to fuse with the eggs. When the sperm and the egg, they fuse together to form a fruit, that won't happen because nature has so designed that when the pollen grains of a different tomato plant come into the stigma of the tomato plant, that is when the fruit will actually be grown. Otherwise, it won't at all. Right? So nature has so designed that only the pollen grains of the same species of the plant will survive and grow further to continue the process for reproduction, and the rest of the types of pollen will fail to germinate and perish. This is exactly why we haven't had a fruit or a vegetable called as a mango carrot or a mango tomato. That is why we haven't, right? Because nature does not allow that. Because it would be so weird. Imagine having the best of the fruit like mango with bitter gourd. Yes, you don't want that combination, right? And that is why nature has created such a beautiful process. Now let's go on to the kinds of pollination, all right? Let me just go on to the next page. Okay, kinds of pollination. So there are two kinds of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination, okay? Now starting off with self-pollination. So self-pollination, what is self-pollination? As we just read, what is it called? Autogamy, right? So it is the transfer of the pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, that is autogamy, or to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant. That is what I said, right? It can be like you have a plant and you have many flowers growing on it, right? So if the process of pollination happens within the same plant, you will call it autogamy. Autogamy. But if it's basically in the same plant but a different flower, it would be called as gytonogamy, right? It would be called as gytonogamy. Now, pollination between flowers of the same plant is considered as self-pollination. Now, we are not concerned with one flower or the other flower. All we are concerned is same plant. So as long as it is the same plant, you have two characteristics, or you have two subdivisions between that as well. That's autogamy and gytonogamy. But apart from that, we just call self-pollination when the transfer of the pollen grains, or the pollen grains are being transferred from the same plant to the same plant, basically, right? From a flower of the same plant to the same flower of the same plant, or from one flower to another flower born on the same plant, basically, right? So we consider that self-pollination. So when we are talking about self and cross-pollination, we don't care about the flowers. Again, I'm repeating this. We do not care about the flowers, but we care about the plant, okay? Now, pollination between flowers of the same plant is considered as self-pollination on account of the common genetic characteristics, that is, the general qualities or features of any one plant are the same in different flowers, okay? Now, in some rare cases, as in there's a plant called pansy, and some flowers growing close to the ground level do not open at all. They do not open at all. Now, these special features, not features actually, these special cases, in these special cases we call these flowers as cleistogamy. This means it doesn't open only. It is completely closed, like shut. So what they're saying over here is that some flowers, they grow so close to the ground level. Let's say I have a plant, okay? I have a plant which looks something like, say, this, okay? And I have all sorts of flowers over here. So this is flower number 1, and I have one more plant, but I have the flower over here. So it's very close to the ground level, and the ground level is here. So when the pollen from here transfers to here and the pollination is occurred, right? Now these flowers are so close to the plant, right? The flower is so close to the ground level that they do not open at all. They're called as cleistogamy, and the anthers and the stigma lie close to each other, which mature at the same time, and self-pollination is assured. This means that when the flower doesn't open itself, right? Okay, wait, I'm very sorry. I showed like an open flower over here. Okay, let's say I have one, let's say the pollination is being occurred over here, but my plant or my flower is over here. It is just in its bud stage, but it doesn't open. It's matured as a closed flower itself. So in this case, the anther and stigma is very close to itself and the anther cannot burst open, right? So the anther, it does burst open, but within the flower itself, and the self-pollination is assured in these kinds of cases, right? So Pansy, just mark that because that is a case, right, where the flower doesn't open at all. That's cleistogamy. Now, when can self-pollination occur? Let's see some cases where self-pollination can occur. Okay. Now, self-pollination can occur in bisexual flowers, that is, in flowers having both male and female organs. That's true, right? Because it can happen that the, let's say the bee, it goes from the nectar, that is from the pollen grains of a flower, to directly the stigma of a flower, right? To directly the stigma of the same flower. It can happen, right? So in cases like this, the self-pollination can occur and there is a good chance. So of course, bisexuality, if a flower is bisexual, such a process can occur, right? And it can also occur in such unisexual flowers where both male and female flowers are born on the same plant, right? The one flower has the, let's say one flower has the stigma while the other flower has the stamen or the androecium, whatever, and they also have the same process, right, of self-pollination. So self-pollination can also occur. There's a good chance it can also occur over there. It's only if they're two different flowers born on the same plant, so they're very close to each other, right? Then homogamy. So to ensure self-pollination, it is necessary that the anther and the stigma of a flower must be mature at the same time. It's very obvious, right? Because it's almost like the anther says, hey, I am ready. The pistil then says, hey, I'm not ready, I'm not mature. Then the pistil says, hey, I am ready. Then the anther is like, it's too late now. Then the anther grows again. Then the stigma goes, right? Then the stigma dies. Then the anther grows again. Then the stigma is still young. They're not ready at the same time. So such a process is called as homogamy, where to ensure self-pollination, the stigma and the anther should be mature at the same time. Okay. Now let's move on to the advantages and disadvantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. Okay, first one. It is much rarer in such bisexual flowers where stamens and carpels mature at the same time. So what they're trying to say over here is it's quite certain that in bisexual flowers where stamens and carpels, both of them mature at the same time, the self-pollination will occur whatsoever, right? It will occur whatsoever, right? Now, parental characteristics that are preserved indefinitely. There is no wastage of pollen grains. Even a small quantity of pollen will suffice. Of course, self-pollination, because if it's within the same plant, it's so close to each other that some or the other way the pollen grains will fall. And you don't need a lot of pollen grains for that, right? Because it's so close to each other, 1 to 2 will also do, right? Not 1 to 2, probably more than that, but no wastage. Then the flowers need to be large and showy. Of course, it needs to be large and showy because if it's close to each other, more closer it is, more better it is. And scent and nectar need to be produced, need not to be produced by the flower. Of course, that's true because they're so close to each other, anything can happen, right? So those are the advantages of the self-pollination. Now, all of the above advantages mean great economy on the part of the plant. A lot of nutrient material which would otherwise be used in the production of pollen, nectar, scent, enlarged petals, etc. is saved, right? Because a lot of people, we know that nowadays we have a lot of artificial things like artificial scent, artificial pollen, artificial nectar, all of that, right? So we don't need all of that, and it's great economy on the part of the plant. A lot of nutrient material would be used in the production of pollen, nectar, scent, and petals, etc. It is saved, basically. You don't have to do a lot of that. But one thing to note over here is, over here we are not talking about great economy for us. We're talking about great economy for the plant, because the plant will not have to do that much effort. They won't have to make themselves extremely presentable with having the best nectar, the best petals, the best scent, etc. Right? Because they're so close to each other. Anything can happen in those cases, right? Now, some disadvantages of self-pollination is continued. Self-pollination generation after generation may lead to the weakening of the variety or the species. The seeds produced, though it are poor in quality and give rise to less vigorous offsprings. The weaker or defective characters of the variety or breed cannot be eliminated, and it does not yield new varieties. The genetic traits of the same plant with no change and without intermixing are passed on to the next generation. Thus, there's a little chance for improvement in the next generation. So basically what they're saying over here is, self-pollination generation after generation may lead to the weakening of the variety. This says that since it's on the same plant, if even one plant has a defect, generation after generation, the same plant will again have a defect. And it's self-pollination, so that's a big downside of self-pollination. Again, the weaker or defective characters cannot be eliminated, because otherwise you will not have the stamen and the pistil ready at the same time, and that's very hard to get, right? And it does not yield new varieties. It's the copycat, right? You have the same plant on the same flower, or different flowers born on the same plant, whatever. You don't have any new varieties, right? So these are the main disadvantages. Perfect. Now let's move on to cross-pollination. Okay, cross-pollination is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower, of flowers of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species. Now this too has advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are the offsprings are healthier, the seeds produced are abundant and viable. It can happen, right? Let's say one plant has more nutrients, the other plant is also the best, right? It has more nutrients, it is healthier, right? It is abundant and viable as well. Now, new varieties may be produced by cross-pollinating, because right, we have different varieties also. Like, in so many cases, we have different mangoes, like we have Kesari mango, we have Alfonso mango, all of these mangoes, right? They're different, they're new varieties. So new varieties may or may not be produced by cross-pollinating two different varieties of the same species, or even two species, because you have different varieties also, right? So you get new varieties. Now, some disadvantages would be the pollination is always not certain. Is not always certain because you're so far to each other. You don't even know. It could be 20, 30 kilometers. It's as long as the insect can hold it, because the insect does not discriminate, as we read, right? It can go in any flower it wants, right? So, of course, the pollination is not always certain. And the pollination has to be produced in large quantity to ensure the chances of pollination, which means a lot of wastage of pollen grains are done, because more pollen grains have to be taken, so that even if the insect is traveling 20 kilometers, not 20, that's not realistic, let's say 1 kilometer, okay, 1 kilometer, 100 meters, how much ever, right? Even if the insect is traveling that much, even if the pollen grains fall on the way, some pollen grains can reach the other plant. Right? And the process is uneconomical for the plant, because the flowers have to be large, colored, scented, and have to produce sweet nectar for attracting pollinating agents. What's happening to me today? For attracting pollinating agents, because they're like this is the flower, and this is the insect. No. My insect looks very weird, but okay. The flower really wants the insect. So all these attractive features, like, great petals, great scent, and all of that. So it is uneconomical for the plant, because the plant has to do so much effort, right? So those are the disadvantages of the cross-pollination. Now, until here, listen to me very carefully. Until here, if you have any at all, and I mean it, any doubts at all, post it in the comment section below. I'll be more than happy to solve them. Relax. I'm not stopping the lesson right here. I'm continuing, don't worry. Okay, moving on. Now the differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination are summarized right over here. You can go through it. It's very easy. Everything that we have learned in the form of a table. So it can be a short question because normally it does come, but I'd say just go through it, right? Okay. Nature favors cross-pollination. So the vast majority of flowering plants are cross-pollinated. Some of the various devices or the conditions which favor cross-pollination are as follows. Now, first one is unisexuality. The flowers may be either male or female, we don't know, right? They can be any kind. And they may be born on separate plants. So in this way, cross-pollination is the only possibility. Examples, palms and papaya. Papaya usually has separate male and female trees. But less frequently, there may also be more hermaphrodite trees bearing both kinds of flowers. Mark this, okay? Hermaphrodite. Now, in cucumber, gourd, etc., the male and female flowers may be born on the same plant. Now, then, second one is dichogomy, which says different timings of the maturations of androecium and gynoecium. So in many bisexual flowers, the anthers and stigma of the same flower mature at different times. So in some flowers, the anthers of the flower mature earlier than the stigma. That's protodendry. Example is bhindi, sweet pea, salvia, and sunflower. Bhindi is nothing but ladyfinger. Right? So in some plants, the stigma of the flower mature earlier than the anthers. That's protogyny. So it can be of any way. It can be of any type, right? Now in self-pollination, we saw homogamy, right? So to ensure self-pollination, the anther and stigma should be mature at the same time. But this is where the nature favors cross-pollination, because in the case of dichogamy, there are different timings of the plants. They mature at different times, or the flowers, right? The anther and the stigma, they mature at different times. So when the anther of the flower is mature earlier than the stigma, you call it protodendry. Now when the stigma is first matured, you call it protogyny, right? Gyny. Now one way to actually memorize this would be, you have proto in both. Now androecium, just take the and over here. So proto or protandry. Androecium, you're taking andry. Then for gynoecium, you have gyny. So protogyny. So protandry, or however you want to pronounce it, and protogyny. That's how I pronounce it. So in either cases, cross-pollination is the only possibility. Then Sterility. So there is a condition in which even if the stigma receives pollen from the anthers of the same flower, the pollen fails to undergo this further growth. In such cases, only the pollen from another plant of the same species can effectively complete complete the process of setting off the seeds. Example, ray florists of the sunflower, orchids, etc. So what they're trying to say over here is, and now this is a condition in which even if the stigma receives the pollen from the anthers of the same flower, okay, the pollen fails to The pollen fails to undergo further growth. In such cases, only the pollen from another plants of the same species can effectively complete the process, right? Of the same species from another plant, not the same plant, from another plant of the same species. So in this case, also cross-pollination comes in help, right? Now, fourth one, hercogamy. It is mechanical or structural barriers. Now, in some flowers, the pollen of a flower cannot reach the stigma of the flower. For example, a hood covering the stigma acts as a mechanical barrier in pansy flowers, iris, etc. So this is where again cross-pollination comes in like a hero. Then we have Hetero Style. Again, that's how I pronounce it. You can pronounce it however you want. So in such flowers, the stigma and anthers grow at different heights, which does not favor self-pollination, because as you know, especially in wind-pollinated flowers like, say, maize, wheat and all of that, the stigma has to be large and feathery. So sometimes the height does not match up. So this is also one of the reasons where, again, cross-pollination comes like a hero, right? Perfect. Now let's move on to the next page and let's talk about the agents of cross-pollination. It's a very easy one. This is one of the easiest things in the chapter. Okay, agents of cross-pollination. The two commonest agents of cross-pollination are insects and wind, but some flowers are also pollinated by certain animals and birds like squirrels, bats, etc., or even by water in the case of some aquatic plants. Each category has some special features to promote chances of pollination. Insect pollinated or entomophilous flowers usually have the following characteristics. So insect pollinated, or again, since this is 9th grade, a little more advanced version, right? So you'll have more terms like entomophilous and all of that. So some features of insect pollinated plants would be the flowers are large, they're usually brightly colored, they have emit scent for attracting the insects, they produce nectars, the pollen grains are sticky, the stigma is sticky so that they can catch the pollen grains very easily, and they do not generally hang out from the flower, they're inside the flower, within the flower. The flowers tend to be in clusters, so to make them conspicuous, conspicuous, especially in cases where individual flowers are small. So the flowers are in clusters, so at least in one of them, the pollen grains can fall, right? Then second one, wind pollinated, that is anemophilous. Now flowers usually possess special features like flowers are small, they're not brightly colored, they don't produce sweet scent because they don't need to attract insects in this case, right? And wind is not a living organism or whatever. So the stamens are long and hang out of the flower. They're exposed to the wind, of course, so that they can burst open. The anthers are large and loosely attached to the filament so that so the slightest wind may move them. So next one, pollen is produced in very large quantities. So how much ever the wind takes, because the wind sometimes is very strong, very light. So you should have pollen in more quantity so that at least the slightest chance, you have the slightest chance of the pollen grains actually falling onto the plant, right? Then the pollen grains are very, very light, dry and smooth. Now you tell me, if I take a blow dryer and I have a very sticky slime like substance and I have sugar, which one will fly easier, or which one will actually go off the table that I put them on? Sugar, right? Why? Because it's a dry substance, it's very light. Similarly, if in the case of wind pollinated plants we put sticky pollen grains, they won't be able to go with the wind, right? That is why we have very light and dry, so that they can almost float in the air and they can reach their destination very properly. Okay, now the stigmas are feathery and they hang out so that if the pollen grains are coming from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the stigma can catch them at least 1 to 2 so that the pollen tube can be formed and the reproduction can take place. Then water pollinated plants or hydrophilics. Now they are found only in aquatic plants, of course, because they're water pollinated, and they have the following characteristics. Pollens are usually produced in large numbers because so that they can float on the flower and they can reach the stigma very properly. In some plants, the pollen grains have specific gravity almost equal to that of water. Of course, the gravity and the density has to be equal or less than the water so that they can float on water, right? And so that they remain floating below the surface of the water. Now, in some special cases, main flowers are such that they float on the surface of the water till they meet the female flowers. In some cases, and such cases are Vallisneria, and some flowers are pollinated by birds, ornithophyli, begonia, canna. It is the pollination affected by elephants as well. So you have all kinds of pollination, right? Now, one example over here I'd like to show all of you. Oops. Right. Okay, as you can see over here, this is an image of how a wind pollination looks like. So as you can see, the pollen grains also have a waxy coating on them so that they can resist the pressure of water and they can float properly and they don't get extremely wet. Yes, exactly wet. And the male flower and the female flower, they are two different flowers. And as you can see, the pollen grains are just floating on the water. And this is your stigma. Again, just hanging out in the air, just like the anther. Okay, perfect. So with this, we come to an end of cross-pollination. Just one more paragraph on the next page. Let's quickly go to the next page. Let's finish that off and let's go on to artificial pollination and some examples of pollination. Now, when we talk about some examples of pollination, make sure that you actually learn that part because it's very, very important. So once we come to that part, I'll tell you what all you have to learn, but just look at it, okay? Okay, so before we read this paragraph, just go through this table. That's wind pollinated and insect pollinated flowers because also it's very, very important. And yeah, moving forward. Hydrophily is found in Rafflesia, whose flowers are very large and are found at ground level. And the pollen grains of one flower get attached to the feet of the elephants and may be carried to the stigma of the another plant when trampled by their feet. Makes sense, right? Okay, so elephants can also be one kind of an agent. We didn't know that, did we? Okay, anyway. So now we do. We learned everything. We learn something new every single day. Okay, now let's move on to artificial pollination. Okay, artificial pollination. So when man himself transfers pollen to the stigma, it is called as artificial pollination. In the ancient civilization, it was a common practice to sprinkle male flowers of the palms on the female flowers, of course. At the time, they never knew about the sexuality of the palm flowers nor nothing about pollination. So they actually used to take the pollen grains and transfer it to the stigma because they never knew that they could actually pollinate. They never knew about bisexual flowers, unisexual flowers, all of that. So this came into existence when people actually discovered it. That's not too long back ago, but also quite long back ago, if you know. Just in the middle, right? So just then they actually discovered about unisexual flowers, bisexual flowers, all about gardening, etc., just about flowers in general, and that is how they got to know about just normal pollination. So people stopped doing artificial pollination, but of course people still do it because we never know. Pollination is something that is basically on luck. If the pollen grains are lucky, if the flower is lucky, they will receive the pollen grains. If the farmers are lucky, they will receive the pollen grains. If not, well, the wind and the insect have to do this anyway. So, yeah. Well, in modern times, artificial pollination, also called as artificial crossing, is a standard practice of adopted by plant breeders and scientists in their efforts to evolve new varieties, of course, right? Now, in today's world, as I said before as well, let's say today, there's a mango season going on, right? And I bought home different varieties: Kesari, Alfonso, Tom. I don't know. I don't know the mango breeds or the mango companies. I'm just making up some names. Let's say I just bring all these different types of varieties, and I love Kesari the most, right? Why? Because it's a different variety. And how are these varieties formed? Not because people purposely make these plants by hand. No. That's not possible. It actually happens by artificial pollination because you can take different varieties of the same plant and mix them together and build a great plant, right? That is how you also get cherry tomatoes. You get different breeds of the same kind of fruit or vegetable, right? So in modern times also it is used by plant breeders or scientists, right? Now they cover these flowers with plastic bags and later they pollinate. Now such flowers with pollen from the plants of desired variety, right? In such a case, we get our desired fruit or vegetable. Perfect. Now let's move on to some examples of pollination. Okay, so the insects as the bee alight on the corolla. Okay, let me just show you this picture while I read this. And let's refer to this picture, all right? Okay, so in Fig 5.4, as you can see over here, this is Fig 5.4, the insects such as a bee, they alight on the corolla, and the bee thrusts its long tongue in the search of nectar. In this struggle, the wing petals, so-called wing petals, right? The wing petals of the flower are depressed. The wing petals, along with the keel petal, are forced down, and the stamen and the stigma touch the undesired body of the insect. If this insect has already visited another flower, it may have pollen sticking on its body, or the pollen will come on its body. So you can either have the pollination right now, or you can just hope that these pollen grains are transferred properly. Right? Now the pollen is now transferred to the stigma of this new flower, thus affecting pollination. When the insect flies away, it may in turn carry some pollen of this flower to other similar flowers. However, if cross-pollination does not take place, there is every chance of self-pollination in this case, since two stamens and carpels are enclosed together. So probably struggling, it takes the pollen from the stamens quickly and then transfers it to the stigma unknowingly also. We don't know. Pollination can happen any way at all. Right? Pollination can happen any way at all. And so as you can see over here, this is the wing petal. Let me just take my cursor. Yeah, this is the wing petal. This is the keel petal. These are the sepals, standard petals. Okay, all of this. And basically just touches the flower, the stamen comes in contact with the insect, and that is how pollination takes place. That is how nature has created everything, right? Now, since both the stamens and carpels are enclosed within the keel and more or less at the same level, self-pollination can also occur, as I said. Okay, now let's move on to wind-pollinated maize. And this will be the last concept that we will cover for this video. Since it's already quite late, we will cover fertilization in the next video, alright? Fine. So pollination is brought by wind. As the wind blows, the pollen from the outwardly hanging anthers in the tassel is blown away easily because the anthers are so loosely attached to the filament that the slightest wind will shake them, and the pollen blown away by the wind may fall on the feathery stigmas of the female flowers, which have large surface for this purpose, and the male flowers mature earlier than the female ones, and so that there are less chances for pollination. Just the same old stuff, basically, right? I think there's nothing to explain in this. It's very obvious, and I've already told you about this when we were talking about wind-pollinated plants. So this is just an example of maize in this case, all right? Okay, let's just do a progress check really quickly. I won't show you the answers because the answers are written in this one, but let me try to rub it. If not, I'll give it to you as homework, okay? Okay, so what I figured is the match the following is already done, but complete the following statements is not. So let's just solve the complete the following statements, and I dare you to not look at the answers and write the answers by your own for the match the following in your textbook, all right? And post the answers in the comment section below. Don't look at the screen. I'll just rub this off simply. Just don't. Yeah, done. Now complete the following statements. Pollination is the process of transfer of. I'll give you 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pollination is the process of the transfer of the pollen grains of one flower to the stigma of another flower, or the same flower of the same species, basically, right? Oops. Moving ahead. The two kinds of pollination are very easy, right? Self-pollination and cross-pollination. For self-pollination, the flowers need not to be very easy again, right? They need not to be extremely attractive, large, colored, all of that. It's not needed. For self-pollination, dash and dash must be mature at the same time. Very easy. Extremely easy, right? The stigma and the androecium or the gynoecium. No, not the gynoecium, sorry. The gynoecium and the androecium should be mature at the same time. Now, self-pollination does not yield different varieties. It does not. Now, in dash pollination, there is wastage of very easy. In cross-pollination, there's a lot of wastage of pollen grains because the pollen grains need to be produced in a larger variety. We all know that. That's one of the disadvantages, right? Okay, so with this, we come to an end of this video. Stay tuned for the next video where we'll talk about fertilization. And I'll see you guys next week. If you have any doubts, post in the comment section below as of now. Bye.